In this tutorial, I'll be going over iteration on a skeleton and a rig with a new character, as well as a basic setup for a ZLeg. I'm just starting with just a basic leg structure. Let's just call this knee lift. Give these a little bit more clear names. So we just have a knee, or thigh, knee, ankle. Then we go down to the foot, and we have 3 toes. It's all pretty simple. Then I have a root joint, just because to work on game characters, you generally want to 0-0 world joint to drive your overall character motion. So I just throw that in there. And it's not necessary to have a root joint for the rigging system itself, as long as you just have a single joint at the top hierarchy. That's what really matters. I'm going to go ahead and characterize the skeleton. Open the rigging tools here. So first, we're just going to go ahead and set up our basic regions for the leg. So this one is going to be our IK chain through the actual leg itself. This is just a pivot of the ankle, or I guess the ball of the foot that in the reverse leg kind of feels like the ankle. We'll do toe, front, there. And just toe back. So with those basic regions defined, we can just jump right in and start building out some rigging. So first we want the left leg as an IK. And we'll do the left foot in FK. I'm pulling this out here really because I know that's where I'm going to want it, just from knowing how I'm building this. This gives me a little handle to grab that ankle and rotate. It'll become more clear as I add the extra joints here, why that's out front. So now we have basic IK with the ability to rotate from here, but trying to control a reverse foot like this from the actual ankle here isn't very nice to animate with. We want another control at the angle that allows us to control the pivot. So we kind of want a pivot point at the ankle where we can swing the IK on an arc from the ankle and just affect this upper part of the leg while keeping the foot itself planted. And then we want one more control at kind of the base of the foot here. That will be our broad control. So we have a broad control over the entire leg itself. We have a pivot point for the IK, so we can swing on the axis here. And then we have an individual pivot of the ankle. So to do that, we're going to need a couple of more joints. I'm just going to duplicate the foot here and delete everything underneath it, because it's a little bit faster. We'll call this one the leg IK pivot. That's going to be in the same hierarchy of the foot itself, at the end of the ankle here. And the other one I want is going to be parented off of the foot. Let's call it foot base. And I'll be showing you the tools that you can use to do exploration. You'll be able to modify all of this information. You don't need to have this plan laid out before you start. All you really need to do is understand how these tools work, and you can experiment with it until you get the right combination of things to kind of build the structure you need for reverse leg or whatever other unique components that you're building. So first thing is these two new joints we just duplicated and made. They aren't a part of the whole character setup right yet. So we can right click and just do add new joints. This will run through all the joints off of the root joint and find any of them that don't have connections into the network underneath the rig, or properties that are necessary, like this export property. And we don't actually want either of these new joints to export. These are just essentially new pivot points or new broad controls for the rig itself, but not part of the deformation skeleton. So we'll turn off their exporting. Then we'll go to the, they still need regions, so we'll do left, legs, let's call them leg base and leg pivot. So let's look at the pivot first. So since this pivot is in the hierarchy following the IK handle, when I move the IK handle, the pivot is going to be moved. But I want this to actually be a pivot point for the IK handle itself. So if I just build an FK region here and try to set up that relationship between this control and this one, you can kind of see here that the IK handle is controlling this right now. And if we try to constrain the IK handle to this, it's going to create a cycle. And cycles in Maya are always a pain to kind of work off of. So in order to break that hierarchy, we have this world space checkbox. Back to the pivot, check world space. So this breaks the relationship between this control object and the rest of the rig, so that we can use this as just a pivot point. And we don't have to worry about cycling the control above it. Essentially this is not in any hierarchy anymore. Well, actually technically it's in the root joint hierarchy, which is just the top level of the character. But otherwise not in any important hierarchy that's going to contribute to a cycle. So we can go ahead and create a constraint here. One additional thing to pay attention to here is in your default settings, your overdriver's no parent space will be unchecked. And what this means is that if I make an overdriver relationship between an object, you can see on the constraint information here that it actually built me two spaces. It doesn't just build me the pull vector space, it builds me the pull vector space and the parent object space. This is so that we can always essentially reference back for any kind of a object handoff between the parent space itself and the object space we're in. And you'll be able to key that constraint. But for pure rig connections and not animated control kind of working connections, we generally don't want that parent space. This again has to do with cycling. So if I have parent space overdriver applied to this controller, it's going to reattach essentially this controller into the skeleton hierarchy, which again creates our cycle. So when I'm building rigs, I generally don't have any reason to have a parent space in my overdrivers, because this is really just single object relationships that I'm building in the rig itself. So I'll keep that checked. So that gives me a nice pivot point off of the ankle, but my foot doesn't hold itself still right now. Again, not a great way of animating. If you can't plant your foot, or every time you move, you'll have to counter animate to keep your foot on the ground. And that is where the base of the leg comes into play. And again, the base of the leg is at the bottom of the skeletal hierarchy itself, but we're going to want it to control things that are above it. So we need to make sure that it's in a world space. The last thing to do is, since this is our broad control over everything in the leg, we're just going to have everything attached to it. Oop. So now I have a broad control of the leg itself. And if I pull that pull vector out, we'll be able to see that clean motion again on just this own. You can pivot this however we want. We also have a separate pivot of just the ankle and that lower connection of the leg. And we still have an isolated control over the ankle itself. You can kind of plant the leg wherever you want, still have adjustment over the IK and the leg above it. And then if you need to, you can do individual rotation or separate rotation off of the ankle. So now that I'm this far, I'm going to go ahead. Actually, one last thing to do is kill all the animation keys on this controller. We only want this control to ever follow along with its driver object here. You're never going to want to move or rotate this thing because it's going to immediately break that ankle connection. So what I'm going to do is hit lock. If I refresh the UI, you'll be able to see that on the IK leg here, that this button is grayed out, so you can't select it. And if I select through the UI, I also don't accidentally grab any locked controls. If you accidentally end up keying this, it's possible that it'll get stuck in space and won't respond with the rest of the rig here, since you have a key that's telling it to stay still. So I'm going to go ahead and save a snapshot of this rigging. I'll save it to demo here. So from here, let's go ahead and just strip off all the rigging. Alright, so I've got a functional left leg. That doesn't do me a whole lot of good if I'm a bipedal character. So I'm going to actually duplicate this using just mirror joints, left to left, mirror across. And I'm also at a point where I don't really want both my legs coming off of a root. I want a pelvis in here. Skeleton, create joints. Every single time I look into the create menu to create skeletons, doesn't matter how much I know that that's not where it is. Right, so I've got all my new joints. We can go ahead and just do add new joints again. That will run through our right leg, add all of the markup, all the properties we want on it, and get all of that set up for us. We don't want the pivot or the base to export, so we'll go to these export properties and uncheck them. And we're also going to go ahead and just set the bind pose here. Since I've changed some parenting relationships, the values on like my thighs here are going to be different than when the skeleton was initially made. So I just want to say, like, lock in my new changes as they are right now. We do hit set bind pose. And if I want to get the right leg up and running real quick, we can go into the region editor, search for everything that's left, and open up this mirror filtered regions. We're going to be replacing the name left with the name right as far as the sides of the regions go. And then we're matching _L with _R to find matching joints. So hit mirror. So we've got all of our right leg regions all the same as before now. So we can go ahead and build our right side. Right leg and IK. Pretty much everyone else in FK. The leg base is our helper control, so we want to make sure that's in world space. Same with our pivot point. It's going to be this guy. Oops. And we still have our overdriver's no parent space checked. That'll just save for you. All the settings in the Helix settings are local settings that are saved to your hard drive, so they'll restore how you left them last. So we go ahead and create our relationships. Remove those keys and lock this control. Now we're back at kind of parity with that left leg. So we can go ahead and load our left leg as well. Just reload that demo file we saved off a minute ago. With that, so I messed up something. I know all my rigging is correct. This rigging is just the state of all the controls. So I'm going to go ahead and save this with both legs. And remove my rig so I can fix up whatever is going on with my skeleton. Okay. So there was some bad values on my skeleton joints that didn't get cleaned up properly, or didn't get set properly, so I didn't have a proper bind pose or zeroed out skeleton. I'll go over those and the 2 buttons I just pressed in a minute as well, because I wanted to show those after I got the rigging all built. So we have our pivot control, our foot, and then our base control. So you can quick see that all of our relationships are still intact, all the rigging is still where we want it, and we fixed up our skeleton, that's all good. So now we're back at a good spot. I haven't been saving control shapes, that's why I have to build them out every time I do this, or just like shape them out real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that rig again. Alright, so what if I wanted to make an actual skeleton change and like how I have things placed? So in the previous pose my foot wasn't actually on the ground, it was actually buried in the ground. Maybe I didn't realize that when I started rigging. I want to make sure that I'm pretty centered or zeroed on the plane here. Wrong way. I purposely introduced that problem so that I know what values need to go in to make this work. That's why I know how to get it exactly there. But whatever you need to do to move the skeleton back into position to get everything set where you want it to, you can go ahead and do, and the toolset will accommodate that. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just for a safety measure, I'm going to set the bind pose here. Setting bind pose will run through and store all of your current rotations and translations into a bind pose property that's on the joint. If we go to the ankle here and go down to extra attributes, you'll see on any of our skeleton joints, we have this bind translate, bind rotate, and then a bunch of affected by channels. And affected by is how my network nodes connect into each other and kind of manage their own connections there. We have this bind translate and bind rotate that we use to store off of our zeroed character skeleton, so that whenever we do zero character, this is the pose we come back to. And then I'm going to do freeze character here, and this one is not undoable, which is why I'm setting the bind pose first. And I'll be setting the bind pose after as well. It's just anything that's not able to be undone is something I always want to add a little extra security in my own work for, even if it's not necessary. So the freeze character is going to do exactly the same thing as freeze transforms on a joint, except freeze transforms through Maya doesn't work when you have skin clusters attached, because it's got connections coming into those values and it doesn't really have a way of freezing that. So you'll get this warning: freeze transform, reset form not applied because it has a skin attached. I don't have to worry about not being able to modify my character while my skinning is attached, or having to go through this whole process of detaching my skinning, like saving off my skin weights and reattaching everything. That becomes a hassle. That's what I used to do, and it's always a hassle. So in this tool set, what I do is, when you hit freeze character, it will duplicate off your full skeleton, have a copy of it that doesn't have any skin weights attached to it, run Maya's freeze transform on all those joints, and then save off a temporary settings file, just kind of like one of these settings files, with all those values that define what that skeleton is like in that frozen state. And then deletes the temporary character or temporary skeleton out of your scene for you, and then reapplies that settings file to your character here. Really all that does is essentially harvest all of the information of what your rotates and what your joint orients are that need to be applied for this to be a zeroed rotation, and then applies them. If I hit freeze character, you'll see, maybe a little easier to see here, Those joints that I had put 15-degree rotations on are now all zeroed out. I didn't have to worry about detaching anything or messing with my skins or anything like that. It just applies. And I can go ahead and set my bind pose. I don't want that 15-degree rotation in those bind attributes. And then one more time, go ahead and load this demo. So you can see that no matter how we modify things, no matter what we do to the skeleton, the skinning, anything along with that, the rigging is just going to always build off of the bind pose. So it doesn't really care what state your character was in when you initially built your rigging. It's just going to build those same connections, build that same rigging on whatever the current skeleton state is. Oops. So we have the foot, the IK pivot, wrong way, and the base here. Yeah. You can see my full leg is still functional even though I've done some pretty significant modifications to the skeleton. I've changed the hierarchy, I've changed rotations on all my joints. I've just kind of rebuilt everything, but my rigging file still works, still applies, because the underlying data of the skeleton is all set to where I want it now, and the rigging just uses that. And from there you can continue along. And this is definitely one of my favorite parts of this rigging system is it was built for modularity in animation and being able to kind of build things out as you want. But that same principle actually applies into technical art, building your skeletons, building your rigging, and being able to build all those relationships without having to worry about just being stuck at any point or locking yourself into a decision. You can make any kind of joint changes you want, any kind of relationship changes you want in your skeleton. Since the rig is being built off of just generic markup data, so this is my left leg. As long as I didn't add like a joint in the middle of the thigh here or something, this IK is going to build exactly the same. If I did add a joint in the middle of this thigh, it would still build an IK here just fine. It would just be a 4-jointed IK. So if that's what you ended up wanting in your design, then you could do that too. Yeah, and I do this all the time when I'm building my own characters now, and it saves me, I can't really count how much time it saved me, a lot. Just that ability to modify my joints, move my joints around, and work on both the rig, skinning, and character kind of all in tandem without ever losing anything is really powerful. I hope this has been a helpful tutorial. Oh, I guess one last thing before I close off here. You'll notice that I've left this aired the entire time I was working here. The little warning message or error found is that the character folder path is invalid, which is fair because it doesn't have a character path. You don't need to have a character path to start building your rigging. It would be better. Like I just saved my rigging file just on one of my hard drives and the root of it rather than in some character folder. But if you're working off of this guy in a character folder already, it's good to set that rig path to whatever your character folder is. That way, whenever you save rigging into it, you'll just be able to load a profile or load the settings profile rather than having to load file and navigate to where your files are. So not necessary, but convenient to have that rig path set up before you start working on your character.